Good afternoon. It looks like prime time to begin our next panel. I'm Ben Warner in the Department of Communication here at the University of Missouri, and my role will be to introduce our panelists, ask a couple of questions, and then turn the floor over to you all. They'll each open with just a few minutes of words about their research and what they bring to this conversation. We'd like to keep most of the time for question and answer, and hopefully some very engaging dialogue with you all. So we have Brett Johnson, an assistant professor of journalism studies from the Missouri School of Journalism. Jennifer Lambe, an associate professor from the University of Delaware in the Department of Communication, my own department. And Amy Gajda, professor of law at Tulane University Law School. And I will turn it over to Brett to start with a couple of words about what he does.
Thank you very much, Ben, for moderating. Thank you all for being here. Thanks again to Sloan for putting on this wonderful symposium, and to all of the sponsors for this event. Thank you to the panel who just spoke to get us kicked off for the afternoon session. The title of our panel is Law and Social Sciences. And I'm going to start out the panel kind of giving a 30,000-foot view about what that means and why it's important today in light of this very discussion, in light of the reasons behind this symposium and the questions surrounding freedom of expression and its place on college campuses. When I go to conferences such as Association for Educators in Journalism and Mass Communication every year, or International Communication Association, one topic that keeps getting brought up, and we may hear it from the other panelists as well, is this idea of shifting norms of freedom of expression, not just cultural norms, but legal norms. And what does that mean? Why might that be a problem? What is driving these norms? There's this idea that if free speech is not something that's set in stone, but is something that is a living and breathing concept, such as equality, such as other changing norms that have been groundbreaking in society, such as gay marriage. Could it be something that the norms of free speech could likewise change from what they have grown into since the 1930s with Neer versus Minnesota, through the 1960s and the civil rights era to today? So I'm not here to, as part of a panel on law and social sciences, to make any kind of a normative argument or an advocacy, point of advocacy on either side. Full disclosure, I'm one of the few people in here who's not a lawyer. I have a PhD, so hence my position on this panel. I approach issues of the First Amendment, media law, mass communication law from that of the social sciences. And what a social scientist has to do is look at a problem. In this case, that problem being, are there shifting norms? Are norms of freedom of expression shifting? And I think the general consensus is yes, that they are, based on the evidence that we've seen this morning in the keynote debate, yesterday in the first panel this afternoon. The next question we need to ask is, well, what's affecting these shifts in norms? And a good social scientist will put on their thinking cap and brainstorm and think of some potential causes. And I'm just going to list a few of potential causes and then speak a little bit about my research and how I'm examining some of these. So one might be the role of social media in shaping new norms of freedom of expression. Well, we just saw this past week, Ben Holden brought up the napalm girl photo, and how Facebook initially took that photo down before putting it back up. Because platforms such as Facebook and Twitter have kind of become de facto public forums, even though they're not legal public forums, but they feel very much like public forums. And it's very easy for someone who finds something offensive on these social networks to flag content and get an immediate gratification from Facebook to take that content down. That could be a potential source of shifting norms regarding our relationship with authority figures, us and our relationship as in students, relationship with authority figures and their role in policing speech. Another role could be the changing relationship between universities and students. When I taught and was a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota, we had a case there involving a student who said things, put things on her Facebook page that got her in trouble with the university. And there was litigation there. That would take forever to get into the facts of that case. But when I posed the case to some of my students and said, what do you think about this? They said, well, we believe the university was in the right to punish her because we have a brand allegiance to the University of Minnesota. Because the university has become more and more like a business rather than a public institution that they should be, that is shifting our perspective, students' perspectives on how they are engaging with authority figures at these universities. Finally, another example possible cause that I'll pose is the greater polarization of our society and in politics. How we are less willing to listen to one another, and we're more willing it to be shocking and extreme. The two reinforce each other. The more willing we are to be shocking and speak in extreme rhetoric, the less willing we are to listen, and it's a perpetual cycle. As social scientists who study the law, our job is, we engage with a conflicting set of worldviews, a conflicting set of theoretical worldviews. Anyone who knows anything about the First Amendment will cite normative theories, philosophical theories, marketplace of ideas theory, Lee Bollinger's tolerance theory, theories that are very philosophical in nature. Social scientists deal with testable, falsifiable theories. So our role as social scientists is not to use testable and falsifiable theories to challenge doctrine. That is not our goal. We're not trying to show, because, for instance, that there might be we can have measurable harmful effects of a certain type of speech that we need to all of a sudden change First Amendment doctrine. That's not what we're doing. What our role is to understand how the law operates in society, as simple as that. And we use as our paradigm this crazy experiment. This experiment is, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. called it, this experiment of the First Amendment, and how that experiment is playing out in this laboratory of American society. So with that, I'll conclude to get to our fellow panelists to get into their research, but to frame what we do. What we as social scientists do is just that, to understand the role of how law operates in society, how this experiment in exceptional freedom of expression is working out. Thank you very much.
So I also am I have a PhD, not a JD, and one of the areas that I have gotten into, one of the areas that's sort of the central part of my research is looking at public opinion or public attitudes about free expression issues, and trying to understand what predicts those attitudes and how one might be able to either educate or persuade people to be more protective of freedom of expression. So 2 points that I would like to make, and then I'm going to tie it back in a little bit to the idea too of how these might apply in terms of campus free speech. One is that I think a lot of the data that we hear about free speech, a lot of the public opinion polls, are very badly done. They're too, in terms of the quality of the data that comes out of them, it's nominal data. It doesn't allow for statistical testing to see what predicts it and to understand the kinds of things that might be helpful in terms of trying to persuade people. I also think that the way the questions are worded are often problematic in the sense that they're often, they don't specify who would be restricting expression. They just ask about whether it should be restricted or not. They don't specify whether it's the government or somebody else. They don't make a distinction between types of restrictions. So are we talking about a prior restraint where we want to shut somebody up and not allow them to speak at all? Are we talking about subsequent punishment where someone can be, sued in civil court for something that they've said? Or are we talking about time, place, and manner restrictions? Because to me, those are some very important distinctions in terms of what you're endorsing. Most of the most publicized polls about censorship attitudes take a very, are sort of condemning of public opinion for expressing any kind of desire to restrict expression in any way, and see that as sort of a flaw. And I would argue that we are actually doing a disservice to try to say that people should express absolute support for freedom of expression in any kind of circumstance. I think the goal instead should be, as educators and just in terms of our civic life, to try to get people to understand why it's important to protect expression and to encourage them to take a preferred position balancing approach to freedom of expression. That basically, as I explain this to my students, if you're balancing freedom of expression against some other problem in society, some other goal or some other good, freedom of expression should start with a brick on its side of the scale, okay? That should be the preferred position, is that we are going to allow freedom of expression. But in fact, there are some things that can be important enough that it can outweigh it. And so that to suggest to someone that because they want to restrict something in some way ever is equivalent to not understanding the First Amendment, I find that to be problematic. And actually one of my future research agenda is to look at whether discussing it in these sort of absolute terms or discussing it in more nuanced way actually shapes someone's attitudes a little bit in terms of sort of being willing to allow freedom of expression. Let's see. So I think the tie-in with what we've been talking about here is that I think there's a responsibility on campuses to do this sort of ongoing education about freedom of expression and the importance of freedom of expression. But then also, when there are situations that arise, so we have this foundation then of having had these ongoing discussions about it, but to allow students to express, like when there's somebody who they disagree with who's coming to campus. I agree with the people this morning that were saying, we shouldn't just not allow people to come. But I don't think it's enough to say to students, you have to let them do their thing because it's freedom of expression. So just, go away. I think we also need to teach students strategies of evaluating the intent of the person that's coming and trying to understand the sort of nuances of the situation rather than to sort of, as Sally said this morning, rather than to shame them for raising questions about this person and what they have to say, engage with them and give them tools to be able to react to that situation in a thoughtful way. I would leave it at that.
That's great. And one of those tools might be the law, and I'm the lawyer on this panel, and so I'm going to talk at you a little bit about my research, which of course is very law focused. I bet that almost everybody in this room remembers what happened last spring in the Hulk Hogan versus Gawker case. And that is precisely what I study. The times in which courts find that media has gone too far in reporting something truthful about a person, an everyday person or a public figure for the sake of news. So this is a clash between the free press rights and the right to privacy. And the US Supreme Court, despite what a lot of people think, has never decided at what point the right to privacy, individual privacy, trumps freedom of the press. And so you might recall that in the Hulk Hogan case, very early on, a federal trial court in Florida decided that Hulk Hogan did not have a claim. This was on a preliminary injunction motion, and the federal trial court decided Hulk Hogan had no claim. And the reason why that was is because Gawker said that the sex tape it had posted on its website was newsworthy. And so Gawker's own assessment was that because the sex tape was newsworthy, it should not, there was no way that Hulk Hogan would win its underlying privacy claim. And that's not so ridiculous, because traditionally that has been the argument that media has put forward. We get to decide what is newsworthy, and you courts don't really get it. You don't understand journalism. And so you can, why don't you trust us and trust us to do the right thing? And so courts traditionally did. And so when that federal trial court in Florida decided what it decided, it made sense to an extent. We all know what happened in that case, that the case did go to trial, many millions of dollars in favor of Hulk Hogan, and we can talk about this later if you'd like. My prediction is that that's going to be upheld on appeal. So precisely because the US Supreme Court has never decided at what point privacy trumps a free press. Just a couple of weeks ago, a federal trial court in Florida faced a similar issue, and that is NFL player Jason Pierre-Paul's medical records. So ESPN reported that Jason Pierre-Paul had had his fingers amputated at the hospital. Somehow it got hold of his medical chart and tweeted, one of the reporters for ESPN tweeted the medical chart. Just 2 weeks ago, a federal trial court in Florida decided that Jason Pierre-Paul does indeed have a right to privacy, so the ability to bring a privacy claim against ESPN. The court rejected the same sort of motion to dismiss that Hulk Hogan had filed. So while I think I agree with both those cases, I am worried now about courts overreaching. And let me give you an example from the Seventh Circuit in Chicago. This too was decided within the past year. And what happened was the Chicago Sun-Times wrote an article criticizing a police lineup. And what they did is they got information from a driver's license database in Illinois. And that access to that driver's license database is illegal. So it's protected information. The Sun-Times reporters got that information from someone on the inside. They knew it was illegal. They then took that information and reported on it, criticizing the police lineup. And what happened thereafter is the police brought a privacy claim, and the federal appellate court in Chicago decided that indeed they did have that claim despite the newsworthiness of the underlying story. And why is that? Because the Sun-Times had known that the information was illegal when they published it. And so even though it's information that we probably wouldn't consider private, height, weight, whether or not these police officers had tattoos, that's it. The Seventh Circuit decided indeed that this was an invasion of privacy of the officers over the arguments by the Sun-Times that in fact this was newsworthy. So my prediction is that these commonly used by media defenses, particularly newsworthiness, are going away, that this is a pushback against push the envelope media, social media to mainstream journalism, and in fact my latest work, a piece I'm working on right now, explores the idea of right to be forgotten like language in courts opinions in 2016.
All right, I think that is wonderful information to get us started. I want to actually start by following directly up on Amy's comments, because I'm interested in politics, elections, and particularly polarization. And one of the things that we observe is that something that isn't a partisan issue becomes a partisan issue once one of the parties stakes out a position on it. And it seems like in this election, the use of libel laws to go after media outlets is becoming an issue that one of the candidates is taking up. Donald Trump famously said he wants to open up libel laws to better sue the press. His wife is presently suing Paper, and I believe Peter Thiel, who I believe was behind the Gawker case, bankrolling the Gawker case, was recently floated, and I read this on Twitter yesterday, so I'm pretty sure it's fact, that he was floated as a likely appointee to the Supreme Court if Trump wins the nomination. And so I wonder if you see questions about using the law to go after the media becoming partisan, becoming polarized, or if you think this is just a different turn in a trend that has existed in American politics on either side of the aisle or no side of the aisle for a long time.
Well, I can't remember precisely when it was, but a federal judge in Illinois, I think it was back in the 80s, said, just based on what was happening in the 80s, mind you, which is what, Inside Edition, he warned and he said, be careful, there's a backlash coming against the press, and First Amendment rights are going to be cabined. And so even as far back as the 80s, you had those warning signs, at least among the judiciary. You see very similar language in cases today. So courts at all levels, in state court and in federal court, suggesting that media has gone too far. There's a federal case out of New York in which a court decided that journalists were liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress. And the reason why the journalists were liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress was because they had failed to follow ethics codes. So the SPJ code, the court used literally in its opinion, suggesting that because that was one way to mark the outrageousness of the journalistic behavior. So I think that the backlash actually goes beyond politics into courts, and very likely, perhaps accurately or not, in some of the surveys done on the American public.
Yeah, I think this is something that I think even goes further back. Just in my class this week, students in class in here, which is awesome. We read the Pentagon Papers case, and Justice Blackmun, who was one of the dissenting justices in that case, basically dissented because he wanted to save the press from itself, saying, hey, New York Times, Washington Post, if you publish this, you're going to lose all credibility. It was a very paternalistic argument, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing now. I think, and we saw it here on this campus with you could argue that the student who went around Mark Schierbecker with his and went up to what kind of what led to the incident with Melissa Click, was him saying, I'm a journalist, what are you going to do about me? He has every right to do that, absolutely, but in the legal realm, in the social realm, people look at that and think that is despicable journalistic practice and we have to do something about it. And then we get into this mindset of we need to save the press from itself, which I think is incorrect. I think we need to, as much as possible, instill in our own cultural norms the value of a free and courageous press. We can talk about ethics in a separate discussion, and I think that's a valuable discussion to have, and one that I think it's a shame that here at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, I hope I don't get fired for this, that we don't have an undergraduate ethics course. We have one at the graduate level, but not at the undergraduate level. I think that's a shame. And I think we need to do a better job of distinguishing, these ethical principles from the legal principles that allow even the most disreputable journalists from practicing the craft.
If I could follow up on that and maybe direct this to you, Jennifer, I'm wondering if you all think that the First Amendment, it seems like it's often evoked to defend people who have said things, or maybe in Gawker's case, done things that are otherwise objectionable, and then the First Amendment is elevated as though it not only provides a legal right to this behavior, but it also should insulate the speaker or the press from any criticism for what they've done. And I wonder if you all think that the pervasiveness of this, don't criticize me for using my constitutional right, if it undermines public perceptions of the First Amendment, or if maybe that's the right attitude and we should be just as concerned about public shaming, putting a chill on freedom of expression as we should, or similarly concerned about the legal mechanisms doing that. What do you all think? Should we be more concerned about people using the First Amendment as a shield to insulate them from public criticism, or should we be more concerned about publicly shaming people for their freedom of expression?
Yes. Both. I think we should be concerned, not just, I'm not so much concerned from a legal perspective that people would use that as a shield, but that it somehow should protect them from people calling them out for being jerks is ridiculous. I mean, I get frustrated because I know that in newsrooms, people do have discussions before they make decisions, and they have these sort of discussions, but then they don't want to talk about what those discussions were to the public. They want to just say, well, we have the First Amendment right to say it. And I think that just makes people mad. Like, are you not even recognizing that there's another interest at play? And I think having more nuanced discussions is actually the better way to go.
And I think people have a misperception about the power of the First Amendment. So one of the cases I read recently from, you can tell I'm a lawyer, right? One of the cases I read recently from California involved a high school student who had taken video of another student making sexual noises in the bathroom stall next to him. And he posted it up online with some snarky phrase, and the student who was in the stall next to him committed suicide. And the claim was that the state came in to I think declare him a delinquent. I'm not sure exactly what had happened, but the bottom line was that he actually made the argument that he was news gathering and that his video was newsworthy. The court rejected both of those claims, but I think it shows how the level of misunderstanding that people have about the First Amendment in that sense.
Go ahead. And I think there's, just before I get, I'm interrupting the person on the name of the symposium, I apologize. But just to briefly say, I think we're fighting an uphill battle. My wife loves Law & Order, SVU, and all these crime dramas, and there's almost never a glorified portrayal of a journalist on those shows. Mm-hmm. And it's always, the journalists are the ones who are obstructing justice, and they always just say, well, because of the First Amendment, and they stop there. Not because of any other important principles that are behind that shield, and that give this shield its shape. They just say it, and I think when the public sees that, I think they'd be more likely to be critical of those journalists.
I think that's right, and I also think that the argument that we are all journalists then ends up backfiring on journalists when someone like the high schooler makes the same argument that 60 Minutes would.
You just kind of touched on what I wanted to ask. What is a journalist versus a blogger, and what's the spectrum?
That's a great question. What I've done in my work is I've tried to hone in on who a journalist is and make it a very limited definition. And the definition focuses on how much publishing the individual does for the public, but then also some sort of focus on ethics. So an understanding of journalism, journalistic ethics codes in that way. So very cabin definition for who is a journalist. And it's not that far off because a lot of, meaning that we have to cabin it in some way. Reporters' privilege statutes have 4 decades. And so we have defined journalists in state statutes for decades.
I'll throw one more question out there and then turn it over to the bright and curious audience. This question is about the university space. So universities need to be safe spaces for people to experiment with both ideas and also identities. And a lot of times this means that students need to feel like it's okay to make mistakes and it's okay to say the wrong thing, especially when having difficult conversations. But at the same time, students also need to feel like they live in a learning environment that's free of hostility, and sometimes feeling like it's okay to make a mistake and learn from it, and feeling like you're in a conversation that is hostile to your identity. There's tension between those two desires. So I wonder how universities and faculty should navigate that tension.
Also, I think we as faculty need to address that on an individual level. We need to undergo some soul searching ourselves. I don't think it should come down from on high. My own view is that at lunch I was talking to Captain Sotrinka about this, and I grew up and I had older cousins and they would always pick on me, and I'd go crying to mom, and my mom would say, like, either stand up for yourself or just ignore them, don't come crying to me about this, right? If you the more you give them this reaction, the more they're gonna they know what they're doing, right? And so that's the ethos that I operate by. But I understand that I'm just one person, right? Not all of my students are going to operate by that same ethos. That doesn't mean, I don't believe that means that administration should require trigger warnings or things like that. I think what it means is it's incumbent upon each of us as faculty members to understand, where we come from, what our lot in life is. And stand up for the principles that we believe in, but encourage debate among people among students who don't look like us, come from very different backgrounds from us, and do it in a way that not is going to offer a safe space for debate, but a civil space for debate. And this is only my second year here. I haven't know if I've found the answer for that, but it's something that I wake up every day and think about. I think the more we engage in those mental exercises, I think the more we can get outside of this false dichotomy of it's either free speech or safe spaces. Well, no, I think we can, at an individual level, we can have harmony with the core values of both.
One of the things that I try to do in my classes is to model that ability to have the discussions. And so one of the things that I will do to make it more, so that students don't have to be quite as revealing about their own opinion necessarily, is to ask them to take on points of view, even if they don't agree with it, to take on that point of view and argue as that person would argue. And so that sort of allows for the beginning of a discussion that is not, it gets the points out without them necessarily having to risk saying that they are the ones who think that. And I also just try to model it in the classroom, like to get people talking from day one about these issues and what's informing them. And again, I agree with Brett that I don't think this is something that should come from on high, that you should be required to say or not say certain things, or you should be required to have trigger warnings. I think that's a mistake. But I think that as a faculty member, you should be responsive and responsible in terms of helping to shape how these students, participate in civil discussions rather than just, butting heads for the sake of butting heads, because they're seeing a lot of that these days.
And one way to do that, I think, would be during orientation for new faculty. So, so to walk new faculty through this in a way that introduces them to these issues in the classroom and teaches them how to deal with them.
Thanks. Well, I'd like to take some questions from some of you all. Who wants to go first?
You have a journalist, Bill Gajda, whose tip of the day is don't believe anything that the media tells you. And you are teaching, and reporters to me are supposed to be telling only the facts, not the opinions. How do you teach them that, hey, the public wants to know the truth? We can listen to other people's opinions, but we would like to get true facts.
I mean, this is a huge topic that's going on now in the election, and I think journalists are scared. I think journalists are scared because they fear being labeled as bias. They fear falling into the narrative of someone like Bill O'Reilly, who would accuse the media of being liberal. And we see it played out in this election, where we're showing we're going to try to create a balance between the two candidates, and it's Hillary Clinton's email scandal, however good or bad that may be, is on par with everything that is Donald Trump. And I think that's false balance. And I think journalists are portraying that as balanced, and they're shirking their responsibility of getting into not just facts, but the context behind the facts. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to teach our journalists to be courageous, and the only way they can do that, I think, is through a society that values a free press. A press that will make mistakes as much as it succeeds to do that.
I would propose that the notion of objectivity in journalism has, the way that it operates in practice these days has outlived its usefulness. That what it has turned into is put a microphone in front of a Republican, put a microphone in front of a Democrat, call it good. But that does not help the audience actually figure out anything. And so I support, there's a professor named John McManus that proposes we replace objectivity with empiricism. That the journalist's job is not to be equal to people, but to actually look at the truth claims that people are making and evaluate it against reality. And to me, like, for example, the coverage of global warming, you always see, frankly, usually Bill Nye the Science Guy, saying that, global warming is real, and then they always have somebody on arguing that it's not, right? That it's just a cycle. And when you do that, you are making it appear as a journalist that those two things are equally valid points. When in fact, 97% of scientists believe that global warming is happening and that it's man-made, or caused by man. And so the more accurate thing to do would be, well, I don't know if any of you watched John Oliver. I love John Oliver. And he did a piece where he actually brought on 96 other people to stand around Bill Nye, and then 2 other people to stand with the guy that was claiming that it didn't happen, just to make the point that, like, this is how it actually plays out in terms of science, what the science says. And so I would like to see it replaced, the standard of, put a microphone here, and then you're good, you're not biased. I'd rather see that replaced.
Next question.
Maybe careful how I phrase this. Part of what we're discussing is kind of on a more macro level in terms of the First Amendment and freedom. But another part of the symposium really is campus life, education, pedagogy, how we communicate. For me, and I even appreciate an answer from our moderator with his background in communication. There's some powerful ways to have difficult conversations. I think anybody who's even done an introductory social psychology class still knows the work of Phillips and Bardo in prison experiments and how people fall into roles. I know that back in the 70s, I think it was in Wyoming, I didn't re-Google it, a teacher who had a class of 3rd graders decided to separate them out because they didn't have diversity by brown eyes and blue eyes. And that one group be the privileged group and one group be the discriminated group. And those are very powerful. I don't know if they would even be allowed to be done. I did them with a community college class in sociology over 20 years ago. And I assure you that even with full disclosure, it was still very powerful and very anxiety-provoking for those students. I also know that I mentioned there's a lot of diversity training. There's diversity training I consider very trivial, like cultural bingo, which does nothing to help people really look at themselves or how they react or affect cultural change. There's also very profound methods that people use. One group that we have locally is the Diversity Awareness Partnership, which is out of St. Louis, that primarily works with helping corporations affect their culture and also have diversity recruitment, but also does community work, where they have conversations, both didactic and also forums where they allow people to have those private conversations based on self-identification and say race, and have another group watch them who wouldn't fit that group and then switch and try to do those things. So I like some background, since we have 3 PhDs here as well as a
I have no PhD.
Okay, we have
I have a JD.
we have a JD and 3 PhDs, if I remember. I'd like to have some of your feedback about how to create those kind of positive, difficult conversation in academic situations, and anything you could share with us about some of the things you know in your expertise in communications and in your respective areas.
I think one is just be fearless. I take pride in this example. You know, a couple days after the November 9th incidents last year, I had a student in my large undergrad lecture class come in, and she wanted to discuss her midterm exam. That was the purpose of her wanting to come into office hours. She's an African American student from Chicago, and I just said, "What's it like to be a black woman on campus?" You know, and I think she was stunned. Like, I don't know if she'd ever heard that from a white professor before. And we had a conversation for an hour. And you know, she's, you know, like, I have since, you know, we have a great relationship. I've been able to write her several letters of recommendation. You know, I think stuff like that. I think, you know, that doesn't answer your question about how to do it in the classroom setting. But, you know, and this is often hard because we're often told as professors to guard our time, you know, to have as few, you know, limit our time in office hours and things like that. And I can respect, you know, where that philosophy comes from. But I think the more we can do that, the more we can open up and be human with our students, often on a one-on-one level, I think will go a long way in helping whatever, you know, racial ills that exist on this campus or others.
I agree. I think opening up to students about the uncertainties that you have about how to handle these kinds of things, to me, that has sparked some of the most powerful discussions in my classes. When I've been able to say, here's what I think that, you know, but there's these 2 points of view and I don't really know what's right. And the students are really interested in engaging in those conversations with you at that point. I think being respectful to students and treating them as though they are adults and not like the quote from this morning, I can't remember who said, but the quote that was read about, you know, well, the students really are children. That I do not subscribe to that point of view at all. I think you need to treat the students with respect, and to help to teach them what are some things, like what habits of mind can you use, and how can you evaluate this kind of thing so that you're not just responding from the gut, that you look at the speaker's intent, and you know, somebody could have been offended by that question that you asked her, right? But your intent was good. Your intent was not to offend. And so for students to start to evaluate those kinds of questions about, like, what is the intent of this person? What are they intending to be mean? And if they are, then you know what, screw them. But if they're not, if they actually want to have a conversation, let's have that conversation. I think giving them tools to sort of be able to assess and step out of that gut reaction to it is really important.
We've been studying how to reduce prejudice and bias for over 50 years, and that's not my specific area of expertise, but my reading of the literature is that the most effective way to reduce prejudice and bias is to have people have meaningful interactions with members of the out-group. And if those interactions turn into friendships, then that's even more effective. And so I think there's no substitute for actual diversity in our communities. And So in a university setting, that means, valuing and prioritizing diversity. And sociologically, that also means looking at our communities and asking how we got to a point where there's so little diversity in our neighborhoods and our communities, and how we could encourage more casual, incidental, intergroup contact.
One of the things that happened on our campus last year that I thought was wonderful was the Muslim Student Association held several times. They were outside of our student center, and they literally had a big sign that said "Meet a Muslim," and they had food, and so people were all over the free cookies, and then they would have these conversations, and it was wonderful to watch. I mean, the dialogue that was happening was fantastic.
I will agree with that. One of the things that really touched my heart as a member of the Jewish community last year is that the Hillel program has a social justice center where we had both Muslim students and students from our NU student 1950 who were obviously friends with the Jewish students and participating in that social justice center. Those are the kind of activities that really help break down barriers. So, appreciate you saying that.
People are wonderful. There's no substitute for me. Other questions?
This may not be the best group to ask this to, but I wanted to ask it since this symposium started. I think you're probably better than the last panel, so I'm going to ask it. Obviously, with diversity and all that stuff, there's been an emphasis on civility, which is important. But things get hard then when you're trying to balance free expression and civility, and we've obviously run into that at the zoo. And one of the things that I found personally most troubling last year with the incidents at the zoo was the response from the central administration about civility. And I was flabbergasted to open my email. I'm going to read the email that we received, everyone at the zoo received. It says, to continue to ensure that the University of Missouri campus remains safe, the MU Police Department is asking individuals who witness incidents of hateful and or hurtful speech or actions to, number one, call the police immediately. Number two, give the communications operator a summary of the incident. Number three, provide a detailed description of the individuals involved. 4, if possible and if it can be done safely, take a photo of the individuals with their cell phone. While cases of hateful and hurtful speech are not crimes, if the individuals identified are students, MU's Office of Student Conduct can take disciplinary action. As far as I know, the administration of the university has never disavowed this email, and I wonder if you all think they should.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think this is, yes, it's a free speech issue. This is a public relations issue. I think the university, anytime something like this happens, universities are terrified. They have no idea how to respond because it's a lose-lose situation for them, depending on which they're going to anger some stakeholder group. And often, what happens is a knee-jerk reaction like this. I think the only way to classify that email is a knee-jerk reaction. I got my undergrad and master's at the University of Iowa. They had a high-profile incident that actually led to I think the president was going to step down anyway, but this kind of was the final nail in the coffin. I don't know if you remember the story a few years back where someone created a statue that looked like it was dressed like a Klan's robe, KKK robes. It was an art installation by a Turkish artist. And the robes were made out of newspapers from the Civil Rights era. And art, as it often is shocking, and his whole purpose was to shock people into discussing these issues. The president of the university said, we do not stand for this. We've asked him to take that installation down, even though it was on public property. Then they received a very large public outcry that led to the president being, this wasn't, again, the direct thing that led to her being ousted, but it was one of the final things in her tenure. I guess my point is, when it comes to these things, I think we need to do a better job of someone, I don't know whose job this is, of training university officials in crisis communication, in issues, in how to engage. I think sometimes universities think that it's a dichotomy. It's either they have to say they're for free speech, or that they have to say that give an email like this. And I think what they can say, I think the university has a voice. I think the university can say, we disagree with all types of racist speech. We do not stand for that. They can take that position. They're a speaker as well in this dialogue. But then they can say, they can then become a leader in helping students and staff and faculty to understand when instances like this come up, rather than saying, report everything to the police. So that's a long answer to looking for a shorter one, but very good question.
We had an instance at the University of Delaware probably about 10 years ago now where it was revealed, there was a local newspaper article that a PhD candidate in the chemistry department was involved in the hate rock scene. Didn't even know that existed, but was shown on the cover of the album that his group released with all kinds of swastika tattoos and all kinds of things. And but during class, he had always kept his arms covered, had never done anything. And interestingly, the university, shortly before this, there were several incidents on campus, like in people's dorms. They had released a no hate on campus thing. And then this happened, and they were like, we actually can't fire him. And here's why we shouldn't do that. And quickly it's changed to no hate crimes on campus. And so, I think training university administration on how to think about these issues, but also how to communicate about these issues would be extremely helpful.
You need to catch up.
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, thanks.
Shall we wrap up then?
Sure.
Thank you all so much for your attention and your time and your questions. And thank you to our wonderful panelists for all of their insights.
Thank you.